Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
World AIDS Day sheds light on those most vulnerable to the HIV virus. And Bay Area legislators lead the fight against Obama's plan to send 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan. Struggles in Sacramento over the next lieutenant governor and speaker of the assembly. And Al Gore on the future of climate change as world leaders prepare for the UN conference in Copenhagen. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. First, some headlines from the news this week. Cable giant Comcast has agreed to a multi-billion-dollar deal to take over NBC Universal. If approved by regulators, it would make the cable provider the owner of 26 local TV stations, including KNTV of San Jose and the Spanish-language Telemundo. Critics say the move raises antitrust concerns and calls into question consumers' choice and competition. It seems unlikely that a gay marriage initiative will be on the 2010 California ballot. A key organization this week announced that it needs more time to develop a successful campaign. And the California Automobile Association plans to cut more than 100 jobs in Northern California by the end of the year as a result of the economy. Recently, the company relocated its longtime San Francisco headquarters to Walnut Creek. And many Californians can look forward to lower property tax bills next year. For the first time in 30 years since Proposition 13 took effect, property taxes for some homeowners will go down, not up, due to deflation. But it's bad news for cash-strapped local governments already struggling to fund services in their communities. World AIDS Day was Tuesday. While there has been much progress in prevention and medication, the face of the disease has changed dramatically. The HIV virus is now disproportionately affecting racial and ethnic minorities, in particular African Americans. Joining me now to discuss the details is Booker Daniels with the Center for Disease Control Division of HIV/AIDS. Mr. Daniels, welcome first of all. And tell me some more about the impact of HIV on the African American communities.
Thank you for having me, Belva. Broadly, there are over 1 million people in the United States currently living with HIV. In addition, there are 56,000 new infections each year. But it's important to note that since African Americans comprise 12% of the U.S. population, they represent nearly 50% of all new HIV infections. 50%. Nearly 50% of all new HIV infections. And when we break that down to African American men and women, we know that 1 in 16 African American men will have the risk of becoming diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime, and 1 in 30 African American women will share that same risk of HIV infection during the course of their lifetime. The HIV epidemic clearly has a disproportionate impact on the African American community.
Is this a surprise that it just happened overnight? When did we start this climb of numbers within this one community?
It's important to note that African Americans have borne a burden of HIV throughout the course of the epidemic. But what we're finding more recently is that as the epidemic becomes more prevalent throughout the country, that we do see increased rates among African Americans and certainly other racial and ethnic minorities.
Why? Do we know why? Do we have any idea why?
There's a complex set of factors that contribute to the burden of HIV among African Americans. A whole host of issues ranging from limited access to health care, stigma, misconceptions, and taboos associated with HIV, and sexual risk behaviors. We also know that African Americans in many instances are delayed in their access to health care. As a result, when they do seek treatment, they're further along in the disease process.
And how's the community reacting to this?
You know, the community mobilization has always been a cornerstone of how the African American community has responded to a whole host of threats, whether it's the civil rights movement to a whole host of different areas. And the same thing is being brought to bear in response to the HIV epidemic among African Americans. Certainly more community mobilization needs to take place, but there are efforts underway throughout communities, ranging from the faith community to the civic social organizations. Fraternities and sororities are now starting to move to the forefront in this issue. For instance, CDC has developed its Act Against AIDS Leadership Initiative, which is comprised of some of the 14 of the largest and most reputable organizations serving African Americans, to include the National Urban League, the National NAACP, and Phi Beta Sigma, all of which have integrated HIV prevention into their activities.
This has been a particular problem in the Bay Area, and in particular in Alameda County. And there, a group called the 100 Black Women have organized, and we see posters around town about this, and they've been talking about this for months. But recent numbers that I saw about Oakland, that Oakland was like the leader nationally in diagnosed AIDS cases. Is that something that you've heard at the CDC about a particular problem in Alameda County?
Well, I can say that broadly that urban communities, not unlike Alameda County and Oakland, California, have borne a disproportionate impact, as you'd expect with cities with higher levels of African Americans. We know that Washington, D.C. has an epidemic with unique characteristics. We also know that the Bronx, New York, and certainly Houston area also has a major epidemic, but you see commonalities among all those different cities. We see joblessness, homelessness, limited access to care. All those things are commonalities you find in each of those cities, and those are some of the things that are being addressed to address this epidemic.
What about testing? I mean, have we been seeing this coming because there have been more cases found as you've tested, or what?
That's absolutely a very important question. Yes, you're right. HIV testing is a key step in two areas. First of all, HIV prevention. By engaging in testing, people know their status, and they also have the opportunity that if they are diagnosed as HIV negative, they have the chance to learn more about risk behaviors. Also, HIV testing has proven to be a great means of community mobilization, as more and more of the organizations that you made reference to integrate HIV testing into a lot of their community outreach activities.
I saw a statistic where young Black women, 25 to 35 or something, AIDS was a leading cause of death. Yeah,
that's a really compelling statistic, that African American women between the ages of 25 to 34, that's the leading cause of death. That strikes down many African American women during one of the prime periods of their life.
Well, in the earlier fights, it's been awareness and testing that has really caused some of the numbers to go down in other communities, so I guess it's getting the word out. So we thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity to join you.
Okay. Well, for other news, we now turn to our news panel. Josh Richman, legal and political affairs reporter for the Oakland Tribune, joins us, as well as Rachel Myrow, host of the California Report on KQED Radio. Rachel Myrow, we didn't see a massive turnout of opposition in the Bay Area when President Obama announced the increase of some 30,000 troops to go to Afghanistan, but we did hear from legislators from this area. What are they doing?
Well, you can pretty much go down the roll. A lot of Democrats in the Bay Area are saying, we don't want this surge, we don't want to fund this surge. And in that respect, you can say that Barbara Lee in Oakland is really taking the lead, because of course she's already got a bill that would take away the funding. No funding, no surge. Now, whether that has a practical likelihood of succeeding in Congress is another question, but certainly for this audience, for the local audience in the San Francisco Bay Area, a lot of representatives don't take too much of a risk by saying that they're not going to support the president in this particular fashion. And they've expressed many different arguments for that, either pointing to, trips to Afghanistan, leading to doubts about the thinking behind the president's call for a surge, or, calling on the president to spend more time worrying about domestic issues. And in that, they echo a lot of the progressive activists who have been calling for protests against the idea of a surge.
Mm-hmm. Well, are they isolated? I mean, is this something we're seeing across the country, or are we just seeing a lot of people from the Bay Area because that's the constituency here?
Well, interestingly enough, you do see it over larger stretches of the country. I was taken by the press release put out by Congresswoman Jane Harman down in Southern California, a well-known hawk, somebody who was seen as really supporting Bush during a lot of the debate over Iraq. But in this case, even though she compliments the president for taking a regional perspective and thinking about a wide variety of strategies to tackle the regional chaos there, she does not support a surge in troops. And that's a woman who has read a lot of the documents that we presume the president's been reading in making his decision.
For what it's worth, I had talked to one of the organizers of one of the anti-surge protests that was held here in San Francisco earlier in the week. And what she said is that it's a little bit hard to really get non-activist people up and out into the streets against this, even here in the Bay Area, which tends to be, somewhat supportive of such efforts, because they're still wanting to give President Obama a chance. And if you'll notice the statements that most of the members of Congress put out this week, even as they were saying they don't support the surge, everybody was very respectful of the president for taking the time to deliberate over this. They made a big deal of the fact that he gave this a lot of careful thought, whereas they feel that the previous administration did not. So they're having some trouble building an anti-war movement when everybody's not all that angry at the president on other issues around here.
And there are no serious consequences. I mean, you think about it, for a lot of liberal Democrats, it's not like they want a Republican alternative either to the president or to their own congressional representatives. So where's the push-up against place? What's the consequence that they can lobby with a threat? They can't lobby with a threat.
Who were the leaders of what protests we had here?
Code Pink, Answer. There are a number of groups featuring military veterans or the family members of military veterans. There are a lot of different groups. But it is interesting that you don't see thousands of people marching in the streets the same way you did over the war in Iraq. And that's because, as the president says, they are two different wars. But I think it's interesting, Belva. I saw a poll in the San Francisco Chronicle recently. About 1,000 people responded. 45% said they thought the war was necessary, unfortunately. And that put them ahead of those who thought it was an unwise escalation, 33%. And it speaks to the fact that there are a lot of people having these conversations at the kitchen table, not necessarily feeling motivated, given the entire context, political context that we're in now, to take this one to the streets.
Okay, that's politics emanating from Washington. We turn to Josh Richman now and talk about politics emanating here in California. Let's turn to the lieutenant governor's appointment, I guess it is, or pick by Governor Schwarzenegger, and the future for Mr. Maldonado.
Well, the future is uncertain no matter how this goes. He has to be confirmed by the legislature. They have until late February to vote on his nomination by the governor. And the governor, in true bipartisan or post-partisan fashion, seems to have picked somebody that neither party particularly likes. Moderate Republicans don't have a lot of friends here in California right now, it seems. And Darrell Steinberg, the president pro tem of the Senate, was quick to say he's seriously concerned about the cost of holding a special election to replace Abel Maldonado in the Senate, an added cost that would have to be borne, about $4 million. And meanwhile, Republicans are already attacking Maldonado, including some Republicans who had their eye on that office themselves, for voting with Democrats on a tax increase and on a minimum wage hike.
Now, this is a senator from Santa Maria,
Santa
which is
Maria.
just close to us here.
Relatively
would
so.
say in the north.
Yeah.
And what's his district like, even if he would get the nod? On
The
this one?
Democrats see it as a possible get. That there's a chance that they could put that 15th Senate district in play if in fact it's confirmed. But it would be a tough fight. It is ultimately a Central Valley district that has a tough row to hoe, certainly, if it was going to be a Democratic pickup. He's held that seat since 2004. He was an assemblyman down there for 6 years before that. He was mayor and city councilman in Santa Maria, where he grew up. He has a great backstory, son of Latino immigrants, comes from a farming background before he entered politics, and he's managed to make a name for himself. He's managed to extract promises in exchange for those budget votes that he's now reviled for by his own party. So he's managed to be, a constant name in the top tier of discussion for some time now.
Yeah. And you have notes on another what could be historic move in the assembly.
Indeed, yes. It became apparent this week that John Perez from the 46th Assembly District down there in Los Angeles may very well be our next Assembly Speaker. He's got the blessing of the current Speaker, Karen Bass, and he says he has votes to back that up and clinch it. But it's not without controversy. There is another Los Angeles area Latino assemblyman, Kevin De Leon, who had his eye on the office, and there's all kinds of maneuvering right now going on. An ally of De Leon, Gil Cedillo in the Senate, still is insisting that he intends to challenge Perez in the Assembly primary next year, which is shaking up this whole idea of having an Assembly Speaker who would be there for 5 years.
That is not a familiar name to us, Mr. Perez. Tell us a bit about him.
He is a person who came up through the union political machine of Los Angeles. He's a former political director of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. He would be, the first openly gay speaker of the California Assembly, meaning the highest ranking openly gay politician in California history. But I think just as importantly to the people who are supporting him, he is an enormous friend of labor. The statements that were put out by the big unions and the California Labor Federation this week were extremely complimentary. They've obviously lined up behind him. And again, as a freshman, he would have 5 years in the post, which would be the longest stint as an Assembly Speaker since Willie Brown was there for 15 years.
And the last time that anybody from the North had much to say.
It's traditional, though, to have the Senate pro tem from one area and the Assembly Speaker from the other.
And we talk about this because the Democrats are in the majority there, so whoever they choose would be the Speaker.
A big power broker.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Josh, and thank you, Rachel, very much for being with us today. Well, on Monday, representatives from around the world will meet in Copenhagen for the first major round of climate talks since the expiring Kyoto Protocol was completed a dozen years ago. The U.S. did not sign that treaty, and no one was more disappointed than Al Gore, then president and still one of the world's leading advocates for action against global warming. Gore, who shares a Nobel Prize with the UN Climate Panel, is a part-time Bay Area resident, and he has a new book out. It is in part primer on climate science and renewable energy and part game plan for a greener, low-carbon future. Recently, Gore talked with Craig Miller, senior editor of KQED's Climate Watch initiative.
Mr. Vice President, thanks for taking a few minutes to talk with us.
My pleasure.
You have a new book out, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but first I just have to ask you, since the next round of UN climate talks at Copenhagen is coming at us pretty quickly, are you happy with the tone right now going into these talks?
Well, I think there's still a good chance that they will get a binding political agreement among the leaders of the nations gathering there that will bring about the beginnings of significant reductions and will also provide as a set of instructions for the negotiators to fill in the details in the months following Copenhagen. It is now becoming a meeting that many heads of state are attending, and there's a lot of work underway furiously right now to try to get the basics of that agreement.
One person who will be in Copenhagen with a seemingly bottomless well of optimism is California's governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, along with a pretty good-sized entourage of state officials. We're presumably spending a lot of money to send them. Do you think that California can play a meaningful role in a process which ultimately depends on decisions of national and even multinational leaders?
Well, California, as is often pointed out, would be one of the biggest economies in the world were it a separate nation. And there have been plenty of times, including during the previous 8 years, when the United States federal government was not willing to act, and yet California did act. And that, I can tell you personally, that has served as a source of hope and inspiration to a lot of countries around the world that were beginning to kind of question whether the U.S. was ever going to do anything. And the fact that California stepped in to provide leadership has been really very important.
How do you feel about California's own efforts? We have our own carbon legislation, as you know,
Yes.
since 2006. Much of that yet to be implemented 3 years later. Are you satisfied with the way, by the shorthand of AB 32, that is playing out?
Well, I think that you've already seen the creation of a lot of new businesses and a lot of new jobs because the solar and wind industry and the green tech, clean tech sector generally is now more or less based in California. And I think the reason for that is in large part the willingness of the citizens of California to support a leadership role for this state in ensuring the emergence of that whole new industry right here.
Now, the folks at factcheck.org, based on advertising, some advertising, kind of did some study on this and say that claims the bill would create hundreds of thousands, they're talking about the national carbon legislation bill, claims that bill would create hundreds of thousands of green jobs are misleading at best. The government's own official economic projections indicate more jobs will be lost than created. Is this explosion of green economic growth being overhyped?
Well, I don't buy that analysis and haven't seen that analysis, but I can tell you it's obvious already with the number of homes and businesses that are being retrofitted with new windows, new lighting, insulation, and other advances to save money on energy bills and cut pollution. There are a lot of jobs being created by that activity alone. And the burgeoning interest in solar power and wind power, soon enhanced geothermal power, the building of this supergrid nationally, there will be not hundreds of thousands, but millions of jobs created.
Well, I promised we'd talk about the book. It's called Our Choice. It's a kind of a sequel to Inconvenient Truth,
Yes.
where the former was sort of the fire bell in the night, basically pointing to the oncoming crisis. This one is more or less a guide to how to respond. Would that be a fair summation of it?
It outlines all of the significant solutions to the climate crisis and identifies some of the obstacles that have to be removed in order to implement those solutions.
Can I read you one
Sure.
quick excerpt from your book? It is now apparent that the climate crisis is posing an unprecedented threat not only to the future livability of the planet, but also to our assumptions about the ability of democracy and capitalism to recognize this threat for what it is and respond. That's quite a statement for a man who was vice president of the biggest capitalist democracy in the world. You're basically saying we don't have the mechanism.
No, that's not precisely what I'm saying. I'm saying that I support capitalism and support democracy, obviously. But what I am saying is that thus far, we have not stepped up to this challenge effectively. I think the day is fast approaching when we will. But the essential ingredient is your viewers deciding that they themselves personally want to be a part of the solution. Because elected officials ultimately are going to respond to strongly held beliefs by their constituents. And of course, California has offered a lot of great leadership on this issue. But the Congress as a whole has been slow to respond to it. The way to change that is for more individuals to not only change their light bulbs and windows, but to help change the laws and policies. by being active in their role as citizens to insist that this be taken on.
There are right now, as we speak, a couple of large-scale pilot programs in carbon capture and sequestration going on in California. This is the fundamental technology behind what they call clean coal. This ability to basically siphon off the carbon dioxide from industrial processes and put it in the ground. Wasn't too long ago you were very skeptical about this technology, but it sounds like you've kind of come around a little bit.
Well, no, I'm still skeptical about it. All of the technologies work, they've just never been integrated and demonstrated on a large commercial scale. One reason for the burden of implausibility that this technology has to carry is that a standard coal-fired generating plant would have to divert 1/3 of the electricity it now produces and sells just to power the carbon capture and sequestration process. And these underground repositories have to be studied and characterized with great precision to make sure they're safe. But it's going to take quite a long time to demonstrate whether it's a realistic part of the solution or not.
We talked with Amory Lovins recently, the founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute, who you know well, and he said something very interesting. He said China will lead us out of the climate mess. You agree?
It's pretty impressive when you look at some of the changes over the last 2 years. In each of the last 3 years, they have planted 2.5 times more trees than the entire rest of the world combined. They've just changed their 5-year plan, and officials will be evaluated for promotion according to a new formula in which CO2 reductions play a very important role. They'll soon be the #1 solar power, the #1 wind power, the #1 implementer of these smart grids. They're trying to dominate the electric car industry of the 21st century. Now, they're still opening another coal plant every 8 or 9 days, so it's definitely a mixed picture. But I think the glass is more than half full, and the existence of a very strong consensus throughout Chinese society to solve this crisis is very, very impressive. I think they're serious about it.
Mr. Vice President, thanks for taking some time with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, to follow developments from the UN Climate Change Conference starting Monday, December 7th, go to kqed.org/climatewatch. And tune in Monday at 9 a.m. to Forum on KQED Public Radio for their discussion on the talks in Copenhagen. And that's all the time we have tonight. Be sure to visit our website at kqed.org/thisweek. We're planning our year-end program, and we want to know what you think are the biggest stories of 2009. Remember, you can also watch complete episodes and segments, and you can sign up for our newsletter. You can subscribe to our podcast and comment on the program. Tonight, we leave you with images of Coit Tower and City Hall in San Francisco, which were illuminated in red for World AIDS Day. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
This Week in Northern California is provided by the Mary Van Voorhees Fund and the Fallis Family Fund.